News of the day.
Mr. Zimmerman, have you made a decision as to whether or not you want to testify in this case?
With values that never die.
There are certainly a lot of controversies or scandals brewing right now when it comes to the Obama administration.
This is American Heartland with Dr. Grace.
Dealing with the federal government is not always high-tech, and it's not always user-friendly.
The stories that matter.
This is a massive escalation in the tension here in Egypt.
The issues that count.
I don't know why the media tries to make this into a sensation. We have never hidden the fact that we supply Syria with weapons.
This is American Heartland with Dr. Grace.
Welcome to American Heartland. This is Dr. Grace, the editor of Politics and Culture at worldtribune.com. Thank you so much for joining us today. This is our anniversary edition. Yes, believe it or not, we have been on the air for 1 year. We began this show July 13th of 2013, and here we are. Where did the year go? My special thanks to Carl Lamb and WTSB, who gave me the opportunity to have my very first show. I cannot believe it's been 1 year. We have enjoyed every single minute of it, and I want to thank all the fans out there for your support. Well, my producer and I, we wanted to do something fun and different and refreshing for our 1 year anniversary special. And we decided we were going to devote the whole broadcast to our very, very special guest. He is the leading critic of the Obama regime. And we thought the fans out there, his fans, my fans, his national fans, his local fans, everybody out there would really appreciate getting to know the man behind the microphone. And I am talking about the very special Jeff Kuhner, the host on WRKO's morning show, The Kuhner Report. He now has the #1 show in Boston. And full disclosure, he is my husband and lifelong love and a teenage sweetheart. We are literally tied at the hip. Personally and professionally. And I want to say that it is my distinct honor that he has decided to be with us for the full hour so we can get to know the man behind the microphone and especially all the elements in his background that have made him the leading critic of the Obama regime. Jeff, welcome so much to American Heartland.
Great to be with you, Dr. Grace.
Great to have you. So, Jeff, you must be so pleased at the response that you now have in that market in Boston. What do you think attributes to the tremendous connection that you have had? What is the key factor, you would say, about your show that has led to such an explosive rating success?
Well, I'll be very frank with you, Dr. Grace, and the audience at WTSB. I'm not surprised. I'm not surprised, and this is definitely not pride or hubris talking. As you know, I'm a very devout Catholic. I'm a devout Christian. I believe that pride is a sin. I believe arrogance is a sin. I believe hubris is a sin. But the reason why I was so confident that if I got on the airwaves and had my own show, no matter what the time slot, it would be an overwhelming success, I believe, is very simple. I think there is now a rebellion brewing in this country. I believe the people of the United States now understand very clearly that we have been betrayed. We have been betrayed by our ruling class. We have been betrayed by both parties in Washington. We have been betrayed by the leader of our nation right now, Barack Hussein Obama, the dear leader, as I call him. We have a phony. We have a con man. We have a Marxist in chief in the White House who I believe is bent on destroying this country. And we have a government media complex, and this I believe includes now Fox News to some degree, which is not willing to speak truth to power. And the people are craving the truth. Everywhere I go, and I'm now in maybe one of the bluest of the blue states in the nation, but you hear it yourself, Dr. Grace, and I hear it all across the country. People feel that the country is in serious trouble, that we are losing the American dream, that we are losing our constitutional republic, that we are losing our basic rights and freedoms and liberties that have made this the greatest country in the history of the world. And we have cowards among us, and we have traitors among us, and our elites have given up their allegiance to America. We are now being ruled, I honestly believe, by a gang of criminals and a gang of thieves. And what this show represents, what I represent, what I fight for, is middle America. I came from a middle-class family, parents who fled Eastern Europe, fled communism in Eastern Europe, and I remember growing up as a young boy, the stories that my father told me, the stories that my grandfather told me about what life was like under collectivism, under Marxism, and under socialism. They took our land, they took my family's home, they took our property, they confiscated our wealth, everything that we had built up. My grandparents and my ancestors were small, humble farmers. They went to church on Sunday. They worked hard. They toiled the soil, and they raised a family. They believe in the old-fashioned values of God, country, and family. And while we were celebrating a remarkable victory at the end of World War II, the poor people of Central Eastern Europe were suffering another war, another invasion. This time, like red locusts, the communist Red Army, the Soviet Red Army, marched like imperialist conquerors after country after country after country. And I'll never forget the stories that my grandfather told me, how he was put in a communist concentration camp for 3 years. And in that camp, as they were rounding him into the camp, they put my grandmother in the camp, they put my grandfather's brothers and sisters in the camp, and they forced him to bring his children, my father, my uncles, into the camp. And by the grace of God, as they were literally putting up the barbed wire, my grandmother rushed up to a very good friend of theirs, a neighbor in their village, and handed my father, who was then 2 years of age, he was a baby, along with his younger brother Carl, who was 1 year of age, baby, and said, please take them, hide them, they will not survive. They will not make it. And with the communist authorities not looking, she grabbed those two, my father and my uncle. She had 10 kids of her own, 10. And for 3 years, she hid them in a cellar. She hid them in a basement. She took care of them. She fed them when she could. She saved them. Most of my grandfather's family died in that camp.
Yeah, now tell us a little bit about, Jeff, tell us a little bit about, in particular, you had, I don't think the audience fully understands, so many of the Kuhners, the Kuhner clan that basically went back centuries. Even I understand that the Kuhner name can be traced back to, it goes all the way back to Croatian royalty. So many of that clan was decimated by the communists, including one of your grandfather's brothers who was literally a martyr for the faith. Can you tell us a little bit about all that?
Yeah, I don't want to bore people with all the details, but in essence, what I've done research on my family's roots and our genealogy and our ethnology. The Kuhner name is sort of like Johnson or Smith in England or in the British Isles. In Germany, I was shocked when I actually went to Austria and Jenny, my sister, went to Germany. You look up the word Kuhner. It's like, my sister called me up and she said, Jeff, she says, I'm going through the phone book. And it's page after page after page after page. And so I began meeting people from Germany and Austria, and they said, Kuhner. They said, do you know how many Kuhners there are in Germany and Austria? It's one of the biggest clans, one of the biggest family names in all of Germany and what used to be the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Our family goes back over 1,000 years. It literally means in German. Kuhner literally means in German, the brave. And we were sent by the Austro-Hungarian Empire for centuries. They populated us in what became later Croatia to fight the invading Ottoman Turks. Islam was invading Europe, and they were at the gates of Vienna. And if Vienna fell, all of Western Europe and Christendom would fall. And so there had been battles to save Christian Europe for centuries. The Kuhners responded to the call, and they literally went to the front lines. That is the history of my family. And so in our family, we've always had people who have been very devout to the Catholic Church, to Christianity. We've had many priests, many nuns, We've also had, I've been told, lawyers, doctors, etc. But the point is, we had many people who were willing to be martyrs for the West and for the church. My grandfather had a wonderful brother, a younger brother, who was an extremely devout, pious man. He went to a seminary, and he became a priest. They grabbed him in 1945 when the communists invaded what was then Yugoslavia. And they poured into Croatia because that was the root of anti-communist resistance. It was a very Catholic, and to this day, a very Catholic part of Europe. They grabbed my grandfather's brother, and they strung him up in a church. And they told him that if he was willing to renounce his faith and say that man did not descend from God, man was not created in the image of God, by God, but instead descended, in other words, they were practicing Darwinism then, they were preaching Darwinism, that man descends from apes, from monkeys and apes. They will give him a quick death, and they will spare the life of a nun. He said, I will not renounce my faith under any circumstances. They murdered the nun right in front of him, and then they carved the communist red star into his forehead. And then with piano wire, which is how they used to kill people in the Soviet Union under the KGB, they put piano wire through his brain, which is an extremely painful way to die. It takes a long time to bleed to death, and they strung him up, and he eventually died. They killed him with piano wire in the church. That's what my family suffered. That's what my family endured. And so by the grace of God, they finally escaped in 1948. They got out. They first went to Germany. Because of our last name, they were taking in refugees from all over Eastern Europe. That's why to this day I always have a special affinity for Germany and the German people and the German government. Because had it not been for them, my family would have all died under communism, and I never would have been born. I never would have existed. I never would have come on this earth.
Yeah, and I think one of the key points in your life history, very different than so many of the other immigrants that were in Canada where your family ended up, was that your family was self-consciously a refugee family. You were economic refugees. You were not willing immigrants initially. You were literally driven out of a land that you all loved, and you were forced into the new world. A new world, and obviously that you, being born in Canada, you embraced and your family embraced, but you did so under very, very tragic circumstances, not like so many of the other immigrants from Italy or other parts of Europe, where they really went to make a brand new life based purely on will and economic desire to succeed. Your family had no choice. You were forced out, you were driven, and in that family history, there was a great sense that a grave injustice had befallen all of you. And I think that made your upbringing very unique because you were raised with stories of that injustice, and you really cherished those stories. Those stories penetrated your heart, and they had a key part of making you who you ultimately became. So you went to Canada, your father and grandfather, and you were born in Canada. And then there, tell us a little bit about how it was to have grown up in an intensely political household.
Well, you touched on it. My family was very, well, not really unique. It's common among people who fled communism from Eastern Europe. There was an expression when immigrants came, both to Canada and the United States, in the 50s and 60s. Because Europeans were much poorer, they all drove very small cars. The expression was, I came to drive a big car, a big American Cadillac, a big American DeSoto, whatever. My grandfather and father always said, we didn't come here to drive a big car. We left at the barrel of a gun. There's a term that's been used. It was coined in the 60s. Michael Savage uses it very effectively, red diaper baby. There were some people in this country and around the world who literally have been nurtured on the mother's milk of communism and socialism through their parents, and they're basically red diaper baby. Communism, the red is the color of communism. I am an anti-red diaper baby. I am an anti-communist diaper baby. I was reared on the exact opposite narrative, that the key to human dignity is freedom, that the key to living a good, successful life is God, country, and family, that what we have here in the New World, and in particular the United States and Canada, North America, is something unique in the annals of human history. and that it has been a source of refuge and sanctuary for people all over the world. And so I grew up intensely with the Cold War. The Cold War was very real for us. The people that we still had family members were being put in prison. They were being tortured. They were being killed. We had memories of the injustices that were done for us. And I can't tell you how many times I saw my grandfather or my father when they would talk about stories about the old country, and they would talk about the tragedy that befell them, how the tears would swell to their eyes. My father, a proud man, a peasant man, a hard-working man, came to Canada with nothing. My mother would follow him several years later. She came literally, God is my witness, with 2 suitcases and $5 in her pocket. That's it.
And little did they know then that whole family history would penetrate the heart, soul, and mind of their firstborn son, Jeffrey Thomas Kuhner, who was born not just in a family that fled communism, but also in a very libertine Quebec. And all of that and that part of the story coming up next. You're listening to Dr. Grace on American Heartland, upholding values that never die.
The stories that matter, the issues that count. This is American Heartland with Dr. Grace. The stories that matter, the issues that count. This is American Heartland with Dr. Grace.
First there came 4 pretty daughters for the small town southern man. Then a few years later came another boy who wasn't planned. 7 people.
Welcome back to American Heartland with Dr. Grace. You're listening to a very special anniversary edition of our program where I am interviewing one of the nation's foremost critics of the Obama regime. And we are exploring how it is that Jeff Kuhner, the host of the Kuhner Report, the leading show in Boston in a very blue state, how it is that he has become such a strong voice against the corrupt Obama regime and the corrupt Democrats nationally and locally. Well, we heard in the last segment all about how his family fled communism, how he was an anti-communist baby. He was born in 1969 in Quebec, and there the family experienced a different set of challenges. Jeff, thanks so much for being with us. And you and I both share this. Both our families had a contempt. We grew up in families that had so much contempt for the social values around us, for the liberal social values in Quebec. So you not only had a front row window seat to what communism is all about, but you grew up in a very liberal Quebec where the fruits of the sexual revolution were rampant. And you grew up in an environment where your family was taking quite a strong stand against the sexual revolution. Tell us all about that part of your life story.
Well, because we lived in such an anti-communist home, my parents wanted to preserve some remnants of Croatian, like Croatian language, Croatian culture. And so every Saturday, they took me to Croatian school to learn Croatian history, the Croatian language, Croatian culture. And so I was taught by Franciscan priests. I came from a very devout family. I was very devout as a young boy. Those were very fond memories I had with those priests. They inculcated me with very wonderful traditional values, the sanctity of marriage, the sanctity of the family, the sanctity of and dignity of every human body and every human person. And in front of us, however, in Canada, but especially in French Canada, in the province of Quebec, where we were from, in Montreal, they were undergoing profound social changes. The 1960s were there, alive and well. More so almost, I believe, than any other part of North America, with the exception of San Francisco and California. And I saw in front of my eyes the rise of sexual promiscuity, abortion, radical feminism, the gay rights movement, the open calls for open marriage. In other words, everything now that we are living with today, 30, 40 years later. And I have to tell you, from even as a young boy, it seemed to me very clear it wasn't working. I saw marriages being destroyed. I saw families being ripped apart. I saw pornography prevalent and pervasive. I saw the damage it did to women, how it objectified women, how it didn't lead to any kind of a utopia as was promised, but in fact the exact opposite. Ruined homes, broken lives, broken families, broken marriages. And what I noticed in particular, many of the French-Canadian kids that I went to school with, they weren't happy. They were in one broken home to another. The father was divorced, the mother was divorced, the mother had a boyfriend, the father had a girlfriend, and almost on every day I felt sorry for them. I'm like, well, what are you doing after school? Well, now I'm going to go with my mother. The next day, well, no, I'm going to go with my father. The next day, oh, I'm with the mother and the boyfriend. They were like, it was like FedEx. They were just being shipped.
They're shipped from one place to the other. And also, because the immigrants, like your family, like my family, they were very good with their money. And many of them bought in Canada at the time what are called duplexes. So the owners would occupy one floor, and then the other floor would be leased. It would be rented out. And that would be a good way for the immigrants to pay down their mortgages very quickly, to have tenants. That's how many immigrants rose very quickly and improved their fortunes. So my family, your family, any of us that had tenants, we actually got to see how all of this liberal lifestyle led to tremendous impoverishment, because the immigrants who kept their families intact kept rising. They were able to have savings and have more and more investments, and then they were able to send their children to college, whereas our tenants remained stuck in a pattern, in a cycle of remaining always at the same economic level. And so you learned there the link between the corrupt social values and economic impoverishment.
And the rise of the welfare state. What happened was, as the families, many French-Canadian families began to break down, they had many social pathologies that you're now seeing here in the United States, whether it be in black communities, Hispanic communities, white communities, especially in Appalachia. And so what happened was that divorce is extremely expensive. And when you have broken homes, especially when you have a father in the home, you see the drug use, you see promiscuity, you see all sorts of problems develop, children not behaving properly, not having the proper discipline, not going to school, and not working hard to get good grades. And so they begin to lag behind. And then they look to the state to bail them out. And then they become dependent upon the state. And so what we began to notice is, as my father, who came as a simple working man, hardly knew the language, started off in a factory, he actually, through advancement, through working, through hard work, became a middle manager. He went from the factory floor into the office. He mastered the English language. He worked hard. The company admired his hard work. He then became a kind of a troubleshooter for them. They would fly him around North America and the world to fix nuclear valves. And so we actually attained a very good middle-class standard of living. I remember my mother had her own car. That was a big deal in the late 1970s. My mother was always a stay-at-home mom. She didn't have to get a job. My father was able to provide for the whole family. And as you mentioned, my father always said, let someone else help pay your mortgage. So my father would always tell me this: don't be a tenant, don't be a renter, always be an owner. He said, Jeff, he goes, look, he pays me, I forget what it was, $400 a month. He goes, that money is gone. My money is always being reinvested in the house. That's real equity. That's real value.
Yeah, and what we all saw there, all of us in similar circumstances, whether we came from Italy or some other part of Europe, all of the European immigrants, they followed two basic principles. One was the family must remain intact no matter what. Divorce was extremely frowned upon. And the second was that you must always be improving your economic standing. And literally within decades, the immigrants rose and rose and rose, so much so that they moved, many of them moved out of their initial ghettos. They moved to the suburbs. They had beautiful homes. And before you knew it, all the immigrant children were in high school and heading off to college. And so many of the French Canadians who had been born there with every opportunity, they failed to advance. In our neighborhood, for example, I mean, Jeff, you and I know, we go back and we see that they're kind of stuck in the same lifestyle, perpetuating the same values that don't get anywhere from generation to generation. So, Jeff, you were armed then with a window seat into communism, a window seat into liberalism, social liberalism, and the welfare state of Canada. And with all of that, you decided to embark on your professional career heading into Cégep. And I think that your audience or many of your fans don't know that initially you had a different career choice in mind. Tell us about that.
Well, I just want to back up a little bit because this is, to me, seminal in my life, and I can't stress this enough. We honestly believed by the late 1970s, my father, my grandfather, many in the anti-communist emigre community, that America was now flat on its back. The Soviets had invaded Afghanistan. Iran had taken American diplomats hostage. The United States had suffered a stunning defeat in Vietnam. Nicaragua, Angola, country after country was now falling under communism. And then someone came along. And I believe it was the most important political influence on my life. And that person was Ronald Reagan. And even though we're up in Canada, my father and my grandfather cried the night Ronald Reagan was elected. Tears of joy. And I remember growing up, I can't stress this enough, I love that old man. You have no idea how I love that old man. When he delivered his State of the Union address, it was like a party at our house. I'm not kidding. I got to drink Coke. I had barbecue chips. My dad would drink wine. And it would be like we were watching a real American. And when Ronald Reagan uttered these words, I'm getting chills as I speak to you right now. Every time I think about it, this is what happens to me. When Ronald Reagan declared the Soviet Union and communism, quote, the evil empire, my father looked and said, finally, someone understands the nature of the threat that the West and the free world faces. And when I saw Ronald Reagan, to me, the embodiment of America, talk about America as a city upon a hill, as the last best hope of mankind, as the champion of free market capitalism and limited government and individual achievement and personal responsibility, that here in America we have created something unrivaled in human history, where you, no matter what's your background, no matter what's your ethnic ancestry, if you're willing to work hard and apply yourself and raise a good family and abide by the Constitution and abide by American traditions and customs, the sky is the limit. You can be anything you want to be. That was the beginning of my love affair with America. And I say this all the time when I'm on the air. I am not an American by birth. I am an American by choice. And so when I went to university, I honestly thought initially, I swear to you, I wanted to protect the President of the United States. Honest to God. And so I said I went into police technology, and I said my ultimate goal, I swear to you, was to be a U.S. Secret Service agent. I wanted to protect the President. And then I began to realize, people were telling me, you're Jeff, I'm nothing against Secret Service agents, but you're an intensely smart boy. You're really smart. And you do a lot of reading, and you can write well, and you're getting A after A after A. Son, you don't belong in the Secret Service agent. You belong as a professor. You belong as an academic. You belong.
So you
as a
actually
public
did one semester. One semester was in police technology at John Abbott College. And I think, Jeff, part of that was also you had a burning desire in you for justice and to protect victims, which I think comes across very strongly in a lot of your radio work. So this initial infatuation with police work came from this sense of just wanting to, punish the bad guys. And I remember back then you also spoke about wanting to have a leading role in curbing the drug trade. So there was so much of a cry in your soul, even as a young man, to try to improve the world, and especially to ensure that corrupt people got punishment and that victims got justice. Well, you quickly discovered that that wasn't going to be for you, and then you embraced political science and history. Tell us why you chose those two.
I fell in love with history. I realized, first of all, I just loved reading about great men. I loved reading about great debates. I loved reading about great ideas. I fell in love in particular with American history. The founding fathers just mesmerized me. How brilliant they were, how concerned and patriotic they were about their fellow citizens and about the human condition and about individual freedom. And in particular, how much effort and devotion they had to creating the freest society on earth. And so when I began to study the American Revolution, the Constitutional Convention, when I began to really study the Constitution, I was amazed that this is the greatest document of human liberty and individual freedom ever devised. And then I just started to read more. I started to read about the Civil War, and then I began to read about World War I and World War II, and of course the Cold War, which was very dear to me. And I just fell in love with America. I fell in love with its past. I fell in love with its characters. I fell in love with its great actors. I fell in love with its traditions.
So you not only had loved the nation as a young boy, then you transmitted all this love into years and years and years of devotion to learning all about American present, its present politics, and its past, its Constitution, the Bill of Rights, its entire history. And what you essentially did was you fused the values that you had had as a young boy and as a young man with learning, and you were armed with learning that makes you a formidable analyst, thinker, and I think the best debater on radio. You're listening to a very, very special edition of American Heartland. More next with Jeff Kuhner.
This is American Heartland with Dr. Grace. This is American Heartland with Dr. Grace.
Welcome to American Heartland. This is Dr. Grace. We have a very special anniversary edition of our show where we're talking to Jeff Kuhner, the host of the Kuhner Report on WRKO, who is also a formidable writer, thinker, debater, the most ferocious critic of the Obama administration. I think, Jeff, you're really beginning to lead a revolt in this nation against President Obama, and it is because it is almost as though your entire life story, your entire history has made you ready for this fight because you understand communism, you understand liberalism, and you also spent years and years and years devoting yourself as a young man to reading day and night, acquiring a bachelor's degree, then a master's degree in American history, 2 years of coursework in American history. You are all but an ABD, an all but doctorate, and you are a formidable thinker, formidable analyst, formidable debater. You decided that you were going to forge a career not in academia, although you have lots of funny and interesting and remarkable stories about your time at McGill University as a professor, but you quickly decided you were going to jump into journalism and you were going to try to make a difference in Washington, D.C. Jeff, can you tell us why it is that you decided with all your learning that you were not going to pursue an academic career, but that you really preferred to pursue journalism?
Well, I had married someone who was also an academic, and she was smarter than me, and she was the only one that ended up getting the doctorate in the family.
I couldn't have gotten it, by the way, without all your support those years.
So come on now.
I want to say that once we married at age 26, we're basically focusing this show not on our personal lives, but on your professional career. So we've kind of glossed over a lot of the personal details of our lives. But we met when I was 15 and he was 16. We married when I was 26 and I was still wrapping up my PhD. And then Jeff actually left his program in the United States to come back to Montreal. And you supported me through so many of those years as I was doing my PhD. And while I was finishing up my PhD, Jeff was a professor at McGill University. So we were.
That's right.
We were both.
I remember.
We were both initially.
We
were both initially on that academic track. We thought we were both going to end up with careers as professors for our whole lives.
$765 a month. You remember that? That was our budget. That we had
I
when we first got
remember.
married.
I remember
That
those
small
lean days.
apartment
I
near your
remember
mom's
those lean
place.
days.
And there you were. I remember 7 to 11 every night with your little fingers going away on the word processor. You were writing your doctoral dissertation. And what was the Kuhner man doing? The Kuhner man was writing lectures so he could pay the rent and pay the bills so that my wonderful Grace can finish her PhD. But no, what happened was this. I began to do intellectual journalism, column writing, opinion writing, when I was at McGill. I had been reading a lot of journals. I started with National Review, the American Spectator, Commentary. I had loved conservative journals and conservative journalism for many years. And so I began writing a lot of op-eds. And people were saying, Jeff, you're really good at this. They were like, Jeff, I mean, you write with passion, you write with verve, you write with a lot of clarity and a lot of power. And so, and I loved it. I just absolutely loved it. And so I got published more and more. And then I began to fall in love with journalism. And so eventually I worked for a small magazine, as you know, north of Chicago. And then one day I got a call from the Washington Times. And they said, listen.
Yeah, so essentially I think people don't quite get this. You left McGill University. You had been an adjunct there, and you got your first job in the United States in Illinois, and you worked there for 6 months. And within 6 months of landing in the U.S., you actually ended up landing a job at a national paper. It only took you 6 months to achieve that goal once you decided it was journalism that you were going to pursue. So after 6 months in Illinois, you were right there in the belly of the beast, working for a paper that you loved because you understood that it was Ronald Reagan's favorite paper.
It was Ronald Reagan's favorite newspaper. In fact, I used to subscribe to the weekly edition of the Washington Times when I was a college student. I'd been reading it for years. Not the daily edition, but the weekly edition. And it was the only paper I ever wanted to work for because it was an anti-communist conservative paper. And so I got a call, and they said, Jeff, we want you to come down. We want you to essentially edit our front page, oversee our White House congressional coverage, and they hired me as an assistant national editor. And literally my baptism by fire was the Bush-Gore recount in November of 2000. And what changed for me was, and I'll never forget it, was September 11, 2001. I was in the newsroom. I saw the panic. I saw what had happened to our capital. I saw what had happened in New York. And I knew that now we faced the threat of radical Islam, this threat the West has ever faced. And what I quickly began to realize, to my shock and horror, was that the liberals in this country did not see it as a threat. In fact, they thought it was something you can just ignore. And the point I want to stress to everybody is this has, to me, been the greatest shocking conclusion of my life. If you want to sum up my 12 years in D.C., meeting prominent Republicans, meeting prominent Democrats, going on Capitol Hill, is I have now come to the conclusion that liberals and liberalism is essentially America's version of communism. That the fight that we had in the old world that had haunted and plagued my ancestors, my parents, my grandparents, that I thought had been buried when the Berlin Wall came down in 1989, has now followed us here. That when I began to speak to liberals, read liberal journals, read liberal columnists, I said they're nothing more than soft communists. Instead of communism by revolution, they want communism by evolution. And so I began to realize that the battle with communism, socialism, radical secularism was not over. Reagan had only won a battle. He had not won the war. And now with this gathering threat of radical Islam, we had an enemy without and we had an enemy within. And so the 2008 election came along. And I began, unlike most other reporters in Washington, most other editors in Washington, I began to actually look at Obama's past. I even read his autobiographies. I began to look into his associations, stuff that nobody else wanted to confront. And I began to realize we have somebody who is a closet communist. He's portraying himself to be pragmatic. He's portraying himself to be moderate. He is portraying himself to be a Kennedy Roosevelt Democrat. But in reality, he is a disciple of Reverend Jeremiah Wright and Bill Ayers.
And I think that a lot of people don't understand this, Jeff, about your life story. Although it was very clear that you were a brilliant speaker to all of us who knew you. I mean, I've enjoyed, we've spent hours in conversation together. Everybody knows that about Jeff Kuhner and Grace. We're always talking. And when we married, we would spend hours and hours, like literally into the wee hours of the night, talking about political issues. Everybody knew you were a great speaker. And even when you were at McGill University, you were one of the best professors there, getting standing ovations for your lectures and especially for your amazing rhetorical ability. But you never, ever imagined that you would have a talk radio career. And in fact, if it hadn't been for the blowback you got for actually looking into Obama's background at Insight Magazine and publishing a story about that Muslim background, your radio career may never have begun because you fashioned yourself more of a writer. You were an editor. You were a writer your whole life. You were a thinker. You were a reader. And suddenly you look into Obama's background, a piece is published in Insight Magazine of which you were the editor, and all hell broke loose. And in order to preserve your reputation, to even preserve your job, you started to defend yourself by doing radio interviews. And I think this story tells us a lot also about what's going on in Washington, D.C. and what's going on in our media. Because the moment that you tried to report the truth, there was a witch hunt against you, basically. You were vilified. You were on the ropes. And I want to stress to the audience out there how many times we believed that we were going to be without employment. I really believed all those years in Washington, D.C., that at any time Jeff was going to be fired. Why? Not because he wasn't a brilliant editor, not because he wasn't, not because he wasn't doing his job properly, but because we sensed from the time we got into D.C. that there were these evil forces barreling down on conservatives, but especially on anybody who dares to speak the truth.
I'll never forget my conversation that I had with the publisher of Insight. Just for the audience out there, I had been because I'd done such very good work at the Washington Times. I then began to work at several other think tanks. The managing editor of the national weekly edition of the Washington Times, who was a senior editor in the building, Robert Morton, was the publisher of Insight Magazine, which had a long pedigree. It was an investigative reporting magazine. And he called me up and said, Jeff, I want you to be the editor-in-chief. I think you can do wonderful work. We're now going to be hitting the 2008 campaign. There's going to be a new Republican nominee, a new Democratic nominee. It's a very exciting time. And so I said, sure. And so I came back into the Washington Times, and I was on the second floor, not the first floor, where all the reporters were. And I'll never forget the conversation. I was in my editorial office. It was my first day on the job. Robert came in and said, hey, Jeff, look, I just want to ask you this. What do you see as your goal? What's your vision for Insight? What do you want to leave behind as your mark as the editor? And I remember I said this. I said, Robert, God is my witness, and I cross myself. I don't know why I do that sometimes. Look, really, it's the God's truth. I said, Robert, I just want to speak the truth. I just want to report the truth. Let the chips fall where they may. I want my tenure to be marked by this man reported one true story after another and exposed all of the corruption and abuse of power in Washington. That's our job as journalists. We're like secular priests. And he looked at me, and he was kind of ashy. And he said, you better be very careful, because the one thing this city will not tolerate, one thing this city will not abide, one thing this city will crush is any attempt to expose the truth.
And in fact, they really tried to crush you because when the story came out in Inside Magazine, just before that, you had been starting to appear on Fox News. You were a real rising star as an editor. You were even on Keith Olbermann's show. You were on a number of shows on Fox News. Then the story about Hillary looking into Obama's Muslim background surfaced in Inside Magazine. And suddenly, you were a target of the liberal regime. A piece in the New York Times was written against you. Which
well, no, it actually was a front page piece.
A front page story.
It was a front page piece. What happened was this. I had several sources confirmed, actually multiple sources, that as Obama was rising in the Democratic primary, remember, Hillary was supposed to be a coronation. The Clintons thought it was theirs. They were going to return to the White House and let the good times roll again. And so here's this guy out of Chicago coming out of nowhere, this junior senator, who now is beating them in primary after primary. And so the Clintons are now desperate. And so now they do what they did in the 1990s. They do, quote, opposition research, unquote. And so they start looking into Obama's Muslim background. And they figure with the war on terror, in the wake of 9/11, you play the Muslim card, they believe it will destroy Obama. So as they were researching Obama's Muslim past, we found out that they were, and I reported on it. And to my horror, the liberal media regime turned me into public enemy number one. Because what they did not want exposed was that Obama did have a Muslim background, that Obama's father was a Muslim, that his stepfather was a Muslim, that Obama, as he himself admitted in his own autobiography, attended a Muslim religious madrasa in Indonesia. And so they tried to portray me as a bigot. They tried to portray me as an Islamophobe. They tried to portray me as a racist. They tried to portray me as being an extremist. And so the New York Times did this pathetic front-page hit piece on me. CNN went after me. The Washington Post editorial page went after me. MSNBC went after me. Fox News distanced themselves because they want to be seen as, quote, respectable, quote, unquote. Nobody wanted to look into his Muslim background.
And
sorry, Dr. Gray, just one quick point. I made the obvious point. I said it's in his own autobiography. Look at his name, Barack Hussein Obama. Just look at his name. By the way, we had said his name was from his own autobiography, Barack Hussein Obama. The reporter from the Associated Press called me up and said I was a racist for saying his full name. That only Obama could say his name was Hussein, and he only announced that after he won the presidency. But his own name is literally, Barack means it's Arabic for praise, and Hussein, who's the grandson of Prophet Muhammad, that's why so many children in the Muslim world are called Hussein, because it means the progeny of Muhammad, the descendants of Muhammad. So praise be Hussein, praise be the descendants of Muhammad. And so I said, how can he not have a Muslim background?
Well,
his name is a Muslim name.
We all know now that in 2008, the press was really trying to just ensure that we had this story of the first African-American president, and they were not really willing to explore his background. That is now very, very well documented. But I think what we found surprising at the time, it wasn't just that the liberal media came after you. It was also that you got no support from the so-called conservatives for whom you were working, from the top brass of the Washington Times. And in our years in Washington, D.C., we discovered not only the extensive corruption amongst liberals, but also the extensive corruption in the conservative movement. More on that in the next segment. You're listening to Dr. Grace on a special anniversary edition of American Heartland.
This is American Heartland with Dr. Grace. This is American Heartland with Dr. Grace.
You got mud on your face, you big disgrace, kicking your can all over the place, singing, we will.
Welcome back to American Heartland. You're listening to a special edition of Dr. Gray's interviewing the nation's leading critic of the Obama administration, Jeff Kuhner. Jeff, we've seen in previous segments how your anti-communist background, your anti-liberal background, your knowledge of American history, your years in the newsroom all prepared you, although you didn't know it then, for what would end up being your greatest moment. So here you are, you're just doing your job as as an editor at Inside Magazine, publishing a story on Barack Obama about his Muslim background. The liberals attack you. To your shock and horror, your conservative employers do not defend you. And then you take to the airwaves to defend yourself, and you begin to realize that the establishment in D.C., the political and media establishment, is totally corrupt, and there is only one place where we can truly speak the truth, and that is talk radio. And I have to say, and a talk radio genius and soon-to-be legend was born. Tell us how that happened.
Well, like you pointed out, I mean, I was absolutely stunned. Everybody knew my story was true. People in the Washington Times knew my story was true, and yet the Judases at the paper, corrupt, craving respectability, craving access, the Republican establishment, fearful of being called extremists, leaned on the paper's owners, leaned on the paper's editors, and they basically stabbed me in the back. And they basically tried to drive me out of the building. Now, they didn't succeed, but what I realized very quickly was there is no honest media. That in the end, most media people, most media editors, journalists, personalities, talking heads are interested in two things: power and self-advancement. They're not interested in the truth. And so what happened was, as I defended my story, there was only one sanctuary for the truth and for freedom of speech left, and that was talk radio. And so I began to get on Michael Savage's show. I began to do a lot of shows across the country, and people began telling me, Jeff, you're really good at this.
Yeah, because basically you had never even done talk before 2000 and say, I think you began just a little bit before the story broke on Insight. So basically by 2007, you were just still very fresh at that. By 2008, it really got rolling. And within a matter of years, you exploded onto the national scene as a key voice on talk radio. So what's also unique about your life story, Jeff, is that you went national before you went local. Meaning you became a national fill-in on shows like the Rusty Humphrey shows and the Michael Savage show on the Savage Nation before you ever had a local show. So
That's
you
right.
kind of did your radio career in reverse.
That's right.
And as you're exploding on radio, you're talking to the brass of the Times saying that they should give you some kind of a show. And I'll never forget the time that you met Tom McDevitt and John Solomon, and they told you, Jeff, you are a man of modest achievements.
Well, John Solomon has essentially destroyed the Washington Times. I believe he's a closet liberal. In fact, I know he's a closet liberal. He has run the company into the ground. He's now currently the editor of the paper. It's one of the reasons why I left the paper. I believe he has destroyed a great conservative institution. Tom McDevitt, who's the president of the company, to me is a man I have no respect for. I believe he's a whore. I'm choosing my words very carefully. He has allowed the paper to be plundered. He has allowed what was once Reagan's favorite newspaper to be reduced to a joke, to be reduced essentially to rubble. And I was trying to revitalize the paper by injecting a lot of revenue. I was willing to work at a very low salary for a nationally syndicated show that would showcase the Times, showcase some of our reportage, showcase some of our writers, our editorial writers. And they were like, no. And the reason why, they were like, well, you're a man of very limited abilities. I'm like, are you kidding me?
Right. This was a time when you had people like Phil Boyce, who's a leader in the talk radio business.
Yeah, people. He had helped make Kennedy's career, Mark Levin's career.
They were all saying, listen, Jeff Kuhner, you're just a talent. You're a talk radio talent, and we should do a show together. And instead of helping you, people like Tom McDevitt and John Solomon, they basically put spokes in your wheels and tried to stop you at every turn.
Yeah,
it was only when there was... Yeah, go ahead.
Well, the reason why was this. They don't like my brand of conservatism. They don't like that I speak truth to power. They don't like the fact that I champion limited government and that I champion personal responsibility and God, country, family, that I'm opposed to the ruling class, that I will challenge both Republicans and Democrats. And so what they try to do is to sabotage my career repeatedly because they don't want to get my voice out there. Because I was Tea Party before there was a Tea Party.
That's right.
So what happened was I began to fill in a lot for Michael Savage, who admired my work, Rusty Humphreys and others. And then one day I got a call from a person by the name of Bill Cooksey. And Bill Cooksey was the executive producer of a morning show in Boston. He was also basically the de facto program director at WRKO. And he said, Jeff, I've been a big admirer of yours for years. I read your column in the Times. I think it's magnificent. I love your work on radio. I think you're the next big thing on radio. I want to be your executive producer. I want you to come down to Boston, the cradle of the American Revolution, in a big market, in a big city, and let's do some magic together.
Yes, Jeff, and you just skipped over one small and important detail, which was that you had a show in D.C. while you were at the Times, and that's only because, by the grace of God, for a small period of time, instead of Tom McDevitt leading the paper, there was a man by the name of Jonathan Slevin. And he gave you the chance to have a show in D.C. And your numbers in D.C. were so good and so strong that also is what attracted Bill Cooksey. That's a key part of the story. Key people along the way, Jeff, helped you. And I believe it wasn't just your remarkable life story and talents that came together, but also key people ultimately following probably a divine plan that has led you to this tremendous triumph in Boston, where you now have the top show in that city and have become the nation's foremost critic of the Obama administration. I'm expecting great things from Jeff Kuhner. Thank you for joining us, Jeff.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me, sweetheart.
My pleasure. I'll see you at home real soon.
Don't leave me. Don't leave me.
Thank you so much. Happy anniversary, American Heartland. Thank you to all the fans. God bless you all.
Happiness ain't out of reach. Hard work pays off the way it should.
The stories that matter, the issues that count. This is American Heartland with Dr. Grace.